social research. And additionally, he is the director of the GENI program in Latin American Studies. He has taught at the History Department at Brown University, and he has received his PhD at Cornell University and his bachelor degree at the University of Buenos Aires. Professor Finchelstein is the author of four books on fascism, the Holocaust, and Jewish history in Latin American and Europe. The first three books have been published in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and the titles are The Canon of the Holocaust, Fascist Argentina, and Fascism's Liturgy and Imaginary, and then Transatlantic Fascism, Ideology, Violence, and the Sacred in Argentina was published in 2010 by Duke University Press, and his new book, The Ideological Origins of the Dirty War, is forthcoming in Oxford University Press. Professor Finchelstein has published more than 50 academic articles on, and reviews on fascism, Latin American populism, genocide, and anti-Semitism. And I'm going to mention only some of them. Fascism and the Holocaust as ideology, Borges, and the meaning of transnational fascism, history and memory from past, future, a dialogue with the blog, regarding history, Holocaust and culture, on fascist ideology, and the anti-Freudian politics of Argentine fascism, anti-Semitism, Catholicism, and internal enemies. The title of his presentation today is From Auschwitz to the Argentine concentration camps.
That I am myself very much influenced by this new scholarship on genocide studies, which we have listened to, as a matter of fact, in the conference as well, especially the works of Alejandro and Nathan, but also the work of Daniel Levy, who insist, on this issue of which are the itineraries of the Holocaust paradigm once the Holocaust has ended. So this kind of social approach, social science approach, has been very influential to me. And what I'm trying to do actually is something very similar, but with a particular difference, which is, my question is, what happened to the Holocaust paradigm once once the Holocaust was over, but a new period of mass atrocities began? And specifically, I will talk about the Argentine case. And what I'm interested in is how, during the events of mass atrocity, and especially inside the Argentine concentration camps, the Holocaust paradigm played a role, albeit a very different one, for both perpetrators and victims. So this is the main line of argumentation. But again, I actually, even more after being in this conference, realized how much of a complement is. And this is, as in every scholarly discussion, if we want to be very, how can I say, to present this as a dichotomy, which really exists in the scholarship, is either you complement the work of others or you just disagree entirely. And this is, I found myself today agreeing a lot, as a matter of fact. So here my argument will be about the Holocaust paradigm in terms of how it was lived, experienced, and of course imagined during the Argentine Dirty War. Thus I focus on this, on what I call the experiential dimension of transgenerational memory, or the experiential dimension of phantasmatic notions of trauma and genocide. So there is also, of course, this important issue in terms of the traumatic experience that relates both perception and imaginative devices. And that is extremely important in the Argentine case, and I will explain why I think that is the case. I think that this kind of approach helps us understand a variety of issues. First, it is, as I will argue for the Argentine case, essential to explain not only how but why the Argentine perpetrators were doing what they were doing. Because one important element and yet a limitation that I see in genocide studies is that our focus on, and I include myself in this criticism obviously, our focus on structural conversions and discussions today were also related to that, as well as yesterday, sometimes occludes the possibility of understanding the particulars of the cases. And I don't mean the uniqueness, but I mean the particulars, which is to say that different genocides or different mass atrocities may have, or actually have, different motivational explanations. And there is a risk in terms of, in a way, conflating them all by emphasizing only the haves. So I would like, and necessarily, I mean, in a way, the whys pose some limits to the transnational explanation. Again, this might sound unusual coming from someone who published a book which is called Transatlantic Fascism. But in my current work, I'm interested in both exploring these transatlantic and transnational memory connections, but also understanding the specifics of the particular cases. In this clear, obviously in my case, I will be talking about Argentina. Because I mean, the memory dimensions, generally the study of the politics of memory, and again I would like to highlight this once again, this is my point of departure. This is not a criticism at all, this is my point of departure. The study of the politics of memory tend to emphasize the understanding of trauma in the past and the present, but in terms of what is a kind of diachronic history of the events, that is to say the after effects, which are central to the events themselves, because this is how we understand them, both as historians, social scientists, and societies. I mean, this is the point of departure. And in many ways, the history that I will be talking about today might not have affected that much the previous historiographical writings. And moreover, perhaps the point that I'm making, I'm claiming explicitly that the point that I'm making is also possible through the scholarly analysis of the politics of memory. And especially through the question about what is the role of the Holocaust paradigm in the after effects of the Argentine mass atrocities. And then with these sort of questions, I was very much intrigued by reading the sources, and especially judicial testimonies, but also ideological speeches by perpetrators. I was very much intrigued by the presence of the Holocaust during it. Then, perhaps if you allow me, so in that sense, I try to complement that kind of diachronic approach with my own more synchronic approach, which is not really, which should not be really a surprise in terms of my disciplinary expertise, because I'm a historian, and this is what we do. In the sense of, to understand the Argentine case, perhaps I could provide you with hopefully a 5-minute version, my own, of Argentine history, and a very specific one, a very selective one. Because I mean, this is part of my forthcoming book, and my forthcoming book explores, in a way, the origins, the ideological origins of the Dirty War, and it starts with Argentine fascism per se in the 1920s and 30s. So my idea is not really, actually, that is the opposite of my idea. The Argentine fascism, the existence and the history of Argentine fascism did not mean that is eventually one of its most radical outcomes, which is the concentration camps of the military dictatorship in the 1970s, were fascists themselves. Or to put it differently, the dictatorship was not necessarily fascist. Because what I'm tracing here is the itinerary and the reformulations of an idea that originated in the 1920s and 1930s. And by the 1970s, the Argentine extreme right, and certainly one would put the generals of the junta within this ideological constellation, was not necessarily fascist. At best, it could have been neo-fascist or post-fascist. But this is not even my point. I'm not that interested in the definitions of fascism vis-a-vis the dictatorship. And yet what I claim is that within or inside the concentration camps, what happened in a way is a very clear practical outcome of these itineraries of fascist ideology, which is what I call the actualization of these original fascist notions in the bodies of the victims. And here this is related to something that for example, Alan emphasized in the morning, which is this idea of listening to the speech by perpetrators while they are committing their atrocities. I mean, because to say the least, that is a on-the-moment justification for their actions. I mean, not necessarily the only one, not necessarily the only motivation, but part of the spectrum of possibilities for understanding why they are doing what they are doing, because as a matter of fact, they are explaining their actions in these terms. So, I mean, in some of the actions that we saw in the video, the very fact that the baby was defined as an insect is part of a particular ideology. And there are many discussions about the Rwandan case, whether ideology play a role or not, but undeniably that is a dimension that appeared in the video. So I really take these speeches, which in some cases is propaganda, in some other cases is just rhetorical devices during the torture sessions, for example. I mean, just things that they say very seriously. I think they are symptoms, or they are symptomatic of the ideology that is part of the motivation for these actions. So in the book I trace the origins of Argentine fascism in the 1920s and 1930s. I try to explain this as part of many questions that people ask about Argentina, including one, what's going on with this country, but more specifically ones such as why anti-Semitism is so important, why, I mean, we see this actually with the current events. I mean, that Argentina now is at the pinnacle of world Catholicism in the person of the current Pope. And the question in a way becomes even more important, that is to say, why Argentina, at the same time that it has with Uruguay, one of the most secular civil societies in Latin America, also has produced one of the most conservative brands of Catholicism in the Western Hemisphere, essentially constituted by the cross and the sword. This idea that the real Argentina is that of basically priests and warriors. And this is something that emerges with Argentine fascism. And one not necessarily obvious outcome of this idea, but an aspect that as an historian I'm just, in this case almost phenomenologically, I'm just noting, this is part of it, is that other members of the nations are not true citizens. Which is again not exceptional in Germany and other places. In this case, the Argentine Jews are not considered to be truly Argentines. That is not exceptional. We have similar histories like this. What might be exceptional is the particular explanation as to why these people constitute a kind of ultimate other in Argentine history. So this is part of what constitutes Argentine fascism. If you ask me, if you really push me, and as I said, I hate definitions, but if you ask me, okay, but what is the difference between Argentine fascism and, say, Italian fascism or German fascism? And I would say, whereas these two European movements are truly a kind of political relation with leaders which are presented as godlike figures, in Argentina what you have is an extreme right movement that believes that the true leader of the movement, so to speak, the Duce of the movement, is Jesus Christ. So this is a very extreme idea, and this is the particular connotation in which Argentine anti-Semitism is born. So this is the origins. Then in the book I talk about Peronism as a kind of almost basically non-anti-Semitic attempt to reformulate fascist ideology in a very post-fascist way. I will not get into this. I might, if you will, engage in this topic of populism because that's what it is in the Q&A. And then I return to the proper, by this time, neo-fascist groups are after, in the period of the Cold War. Because in Peronism, you don't have the presence of the Holocaust as any kind of paradigm. Basically, Peronism is extremely inclusive in terms of its social rights and extremely exclusivistic in terms of political rights, but is also, ironically, very inclusive in terms of the possibility of becoming a member of the movement. So, for example, with the Argentine Jewish community, Perón establishes a strong pressure to eliminate the Argentine, the kind of umbrella for Jewish groups, Jewish community groups in Argentina, but at the same time, he establishes an Argentine Jewish Peronist group. So, and this is very different from the traditions. It's almost a departure from the traditions of Argentine fascism. Now, 1955, Peronism is gone. I mean, Perón is gone. He's in this is another interesting connection to explore. Eventually he will reach Franco, Spain, and he will live there for a couple of years. And then there is a kind of return of neo-fascism to the fore. And in these two neo-fascist groups that I studied for the late 1950s, early 1960s, and early 70s, which are Tacuara and AAA, AAA being Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, these groups use, and I explore this in my book as well, use the Holocaust as a kind of paradigm for understanding the enemy, and so on and so forth. They are not that different actually from the original fascism of the 1920s and 1930s. As a matter of fact, many of them have been members of the fascist youth, or they have as kind of, they have mentors who are fascists, particularly a group of fascist priests that have been very active during the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. And so in a way, that is, we are seeing a clear continuity. Very important things change on the ground. Again, perhaps for a Q&A or another occasion, but one central issue that we have mentioned here, and it was central in this story, is the Eichmann trial. The Eichmann trial is extremely important in the history of Argentina, and also especially in the history of the Argentine extreme right. They see the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann as a kind of confirmation of their wars, paranoias, and of course that is almost normal because these are very paranoid people living in a kind of fantasy world. So this kind of confirmation from reality only reinforces notions that which are quite outside of reality, and so on and so forth. Eventually, the AAA shares this. We have the same pattern of clerical fascism in a neo-fascist world, also conflated with Cold War notions. The one difference I would say, which is perhaps quantitative, between the classic fascists of the 30s, the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and these groups after the fall of Peronism, is that most of them also are Peronists, which is an interesting thing. And this is not necessarily a legacy of the classic Peronism. So we have groups that in a way are conflating both the legacies of classic fascism and classic Peronism, creating something new. Peron is very inclusive, as I said. He also includes the Peronist extreme right as part of the movement, at the same time that he will include many other sectors. So they are part of the Peronist movement. They involve, they also involve these kind of clerical fascist notions of the nation. But, and this is a quantitative, this is certainly important, a way in which the quantitative and the qualitative dimensions in a way are related. They start practically to kill people, more people than in the 20s and 30s, to kidnap people, to torture people, and so on and so forth. So we have, in a way, a clear precedent to the military dictatorship. Not only in terms of the particular ways in which they justify their actions, but also because there is a kind of transition from Tacuara, this anti-Semitic group of the 60s. Some of the members go into AAA, and this is well known among Argentinians or scholars working in Argentina. And also many of them eventually provided, although they are civilians, a military rank, and they are part of what is done inside the concentration camps. So they also belong to the so-called working groups or grupo de tareas. So there is an interesting transition here, and that's why Rodolfo Walsh, famously a victim of the military dictatorship, sent in his letter to the junta before he was killed, he said, now, playing with words, he said, now there is not much of a transition, of a turning point here, because now the AAA has become the three armed forces. So there is a play of words, but it's very symbolic as well as meaningful. So the thing is, eventually when we reach the dictatorship, we find that these ideas, and as I said, when they were kidnapping people or they were attacking or putting bombs in synagogues throughout the 60s, they were saying, or they were connecting this issue to the Holocaust. This was very, very explicit. But again, in a way, it's almost anecdotal when one compares this situation vis-a-vis what went on inside the concentration camps. And inside the concentration camps, something went on that in a way is a history within a history, extreme history within extreme history, and perhaps to quote that, a very sad aspect of a very sad history. which is what happened to Argentine Jews within the Argentine concentration camps. Now, the statistics are very interesting in this regard. There is, Jews were less than 1% of the population at the time, as well as now. In Argentina, they rank among 10 to 50, depending on how you count, 10 to 50% of the victims. Now, there are many explanations as to why that is the case. From right to left, I mean, whether they were more active in the left or the right, I mean, these are part of the explanation. To me, that is not really interesting, because I'm not interested in, let's say, explanations that correlate to the particular explanation that the perpetrators provided. Which is to say, these Argentine Jewish citizens were not necessarily kidnapped because they were Jewish. Inside, once they entered the concentration camp ward, they were a different sort of prisoner. And it is from testimonies, many times not from Jewish victims, but rather from others that live, as opposed to these victims, that there was a kind of qualitative ideological dimension to the Jewish victims that didn't exist in other cases. And this also is correlated to rates of survival, which were much more problematic, minimal in the cases of Argentine Jewish citizens. So, as a matter of fact, I don't think that in Argentina what we have is a genocide. I mean, it's a state terror, basically. And yet, I would argue that at least in the particular experience of Jewish victims, what you have is certainly a genocidal potential. Because at some point, although they were not kidnapped or selected for being Jewish, at some point their experience became related to a kind of ethnic connotation, of course, as the perpetrators understood it. Because as a matter of fact, some people who were not actually Jewish, at least in terms of how they saw themselves, were not given the option of choosing. Once you were assigned to this kind of categorization, you now belong to the group. Now, you might ask, okay, how to define, how they actually define who was Jewish and who was not, and why being Jewish was much more problematic than being, let's say, accused by the military or sought by the military to be engaged in leftist political activities. The explanation goes back to Argentine, to the origins, to Argentine fascist ideology. And this is exactly what they were telling victims during the torture sessions. Now, how am I doing? 7 minutes. Okay. So my point is that although the ideology, the fascist ideology in Argentina eventually changes a lot and is constantly reformulated, it is eventually literalized, as I said, in the bodies of the victim. Because the dictatorship is not fascist. I mean, there are many explanations for the dictatorship. I mean, and even within the dictatorship, there were a lot of disagreements, including economic and ideological ones. Within the concentration camp, inside the concentration camp, to use Argentine terms, I see this as a kind of fascist universe that they wanted to create in light of what clerical fascism was in Argentina. That is to say, that it was a reality which was totally constructed, and in this reality, Jews were mandated to behave according to what ideology said they should be or do. This violence was presented to the victim as part of the legacy of the Holocaust, not only as a source of inspiration, but as a kind of continuity, or even better, as they say, a kind of making it better than the Nazis or the fascists. Victims generally were mandated to listen to speeches by Hitler and Mussolini. They were many times ordered to, for example, Jewish males were ordered to behave like females, and so on and so forth. This is again, if you trace what is the conception of masculinity vis-a-vis the Jews in fascist ideology, you will see that this is a practical application of the ideology. And this is exactly how the perpetrators are explaining it, and this is exactly how it was explained in the fascist press throughout the 20th century. So this is one of the connections that I see. There were also many portraits of Hitler and Mussolini inside the torture chambers. There were Jews who were, and this is in a way a kind of ultimate example of the perpetrators' will to create a different reality, even in terms of the acceptance by the victims that this is the order of things. famously Primo Levi talks about the Muselmänner as people that eventually had accepted the main premise of what the Nazis want. I mean, they accept that that there is no need for them to leave. And in a way, I see a similar process, which is many times put in explicit terms in Argentina. The prisoners are mandated to express that they love Hitler, for example, as accepting the ideology that is downplaying their humanity. They are also many times, and for several periods, they are put kind of Hitler mustaches in their faces. And this is very interesting because in a way this is something very difficult for historians to approach, which is the particular sense of humor by perpetrators. And this is something that we also see in the testimonies, and I don't take it lightly. I don't think this is only ironic. The ironies betray the ideology. And when these kind of jokes actually have a certain meaning once they are repeated in a particular context, which is the context of the Argentine concentration camps, and once they are repeated in different camps by different perpetrators. And some of these jokes, I mean, you might recall from Jacobo Timmerman's testimony, that he refers to this weird sense of humor, and especially this kind of idea of death related to the gas chambers. So they told Timmerman that they were going to kill him, and they told, in a kind of laughing way, they told this to other victims, and the way to say it is, we will send you to the gas chambers. Then there is other kinds of expressions such as, we will show the Nazis how to do things, as if there is this idea that in the Argentine concentration camp system, you can even perfect the war of Auschwitz, hence my title. I mean, this attempt by perpetrators to go from, an impossible attempt nonetheless, to go from the war of Auschwitz to the war of the Argentine concentration camps. And finally, I mean, there is even a sense of historical continuity, because that obviously is part of the politics of memory of the Holocaust paradigm, and it's not historical at all. But these claims about continuity include things that they will tell victims, such as not only we will show the Nazis how to do things, but this is another declaration by a perpetrator through a torture session. The Nazis lost the war, we will win. Now, this is, Anna asked me this important question about what is the meaning of the dirty war. Well, I see the meaning of the dirty war as not a war, but rather the reality of the concentration camp system. I mean, the state attacking its citizens, believing it to be a war. And this is interesting. Incidentally, another issue that I cannot talk about that much today, but I'm exploring in other lines of my work, not in this book, is the particular experience of Jewish victims in Argentina who were also survivors of the Holocaust or relatives of survivors of the Holocaust, because you can understand how, of course, I mean, the rational way to go, although as Dan Diener, expresses in other of his works, this idea of counter-rationality going on in a context of mass genocide, right? So you might say, well, who will accept this argument? I mean, who will accept this argument that this is not Argentina, this is not Buenos Aires or Córdoba, this is Auschwitz? And yet, the constant practice of torture with the combination of these ideological apparatuses provides the victims with the terrible possibility of a reality split. And especially Jewish victims, and even more especially victims that are related as a kind of post-generation to the experience of the Holocaust. So many victims refer to the situation that they were thinking, where am I? Where am I? I am in the phantasmatic war or the traumatic experience of my family in the Holocaust, or I am here. And I don't take this lightly, and I see it also as a clear attempt by perpetrators. There is another issue. You might remember this issue that actually was expressed by the Nazis, this idea of converting Jews into soap. Actually, there is no proof that that was ever the case, as far as I can tell. But Jews in Argentina, within the concentration camp system, were being told again and again that they will convert them into soap. Again, returning to this kind of talk about the Holocaust, which is very interesting because, as far as I can tell as a historian, there was no Nazi attempt to convert Jews into soap. But they didn't know this, and you see the particular politics of memory, but I would say the particular memories of global violence throughout transnational fascism that goes from 45 to the 60s and the 70s, and it's a particular, let's say, itinerary of the politics of memory, which is in terms of the fascist groups. And here, as I mentioned before, the Eichmann trial is also central. And as you might recall, Eichmann, on his way, and this is told by Arendt, Eichmann, on his way to meet his death, he had this kind of banal dedication. You were referring to this, Nathan, yesterday, but he had this kind of banal dedication to Austria, Germany, and Argentina. And in the Argentine fascist press, and in Argentina, this was very important. This was very important because that, as a matter of fact, Eichmann was an Argentine, they claim, and this is part of the picture here. So to finish, probably we have what, 1 minute, or I'm done, probably.
1 minute.
1 minute. Thank you. So to finish, I would like to think. I mean, to finish with this idea of how, let's say, this politics of memory through an event of mass atrocity affect victims or perpetrators in very clear ways. And yet it's a challenge for us how to integrate these two very different experiences, because they are as different as they could be, because one is causing the other to experience this kind of reality split throughout the Holocaust paradigm, while the recipient of that is in a way is clearly lost. So how to make sense of an integration, I think it remains a challenge for social scientists working on this issue. So I mean, I think that this is, I mean, I don't think I have solved this issue at all. So I will finish with this, and thank you.
As you know, Daniel Finchelstein in particular has been pushing for over a decade this genocide paradigm in Argentina. I was always troubled whenever I read his work. I'm totally unpersuaded. What I'm curious about now is, from you, given the topic, how did this particular trope end up in Argentina, and sort of what is his role, and sort of what is the social context in which he makes these claims? And is there any sort of counter-intellectual movement that says, okay, this is inappropriate? Because I heard you saying that you're rejecting this. So I wonder if you could maybe elucidate this a little bit.
We believe, and I certainly believe that coming from that came from the discourse of human rights groups. I mean, very early on, the perpetrators were called the genocidas. That is a language that politically many of us use. But then, as I said, regarding starting with Mark's point, I think as scholars there is a need for a more critical approach to this issue, and I don't think it flies. I don't think it flies, and I don't think also that would minimize, because this is a concern, in any case, the gravity of the Argentine case. Because going back to the Holocaust, in Argentina, what you have is a state attacking its citizens through illegal means, which is the ultimate paradox of illegality. I mean, it is a state that should provide, the law and order, if you will, attacking the citizens through illegal means. The state is outside the law. There is no way to deal with that. And it's the paradox that there is no way to deal with that. And the only way the Germans dealt with that was through foreign invasion.